The winter of 1955 had descended upon Steubenville, Ohio, with ferocity that seemed determined to bury the small industrial town under a blanket of uncompromising white. The wind howled off the Ohio River, rattling the stained-glass windows of St. Anthony of Padua, where the scent of beeswax and ancient incense hung heavy in the frigid air. Inside the vestibule, the atmosphere was far from celebratory. It was supposed to be the happiest day of Maria Lombardi's life. She stood in her mother's repurposed lace gown, a delicate crown of wax orange blossoms trembling in her dark hair, but her eyes were rimmed with red. Her father, Giuseppe, a man whose hands were permanently stained with the grease of the steel mills and the soil of his backyard garden, stood before Father O'Malley with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped as if the very sky were pressing down on him. Behind a heavy oak pillar, partially obscured by the shadows of the votive candles flickering before the statue of St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes, stood a man in a charcoal-gray cashmere overcoat. He moved with a grace that didn't belong in a mill town, a lit cigarette held low near his hip, though he knew he shouldn't be smoking in the narthex. He had come to Steubenville to see his mother, to escape the blinding flashbulbs of Hollywood and the suffocating pressure of being half of the world's most famous comedy duo. He was Dino to the locals, but to the world, he was Dean Martin. He hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but the desperation in Giuseppe's voice was a frequency he recognized from his own hungry youth. Giuseppe's voice broke as he whispered to Priest, the words tumbling out in a mixture of broken English and the thick Neapolitan dialect of his childhood. "Father, I have failed her," the man said, his voice a jagged shard of grief. "The bank, they took the deposit. The mill is closed for strike. The caterer, he took the money and he ran. We have nothing. I told the boys' family we would have a feast. But, Father, we have no money. Not for the wine, not for the pasta, not even for a single musician. How can I walk her down that aisle knowing there is only a cold, empty hall waiting for her?" The silence that followed was heavier than the snow outside. Maria let out a small, strangled sob, clutching her cheap bouquet of carnations. Father O'Malley, a man who had seen 1,000 tragedies in confessional, could only offer a sympathetic hand on the man's shoulder. "We have the grace of God, Giuseppe," the priest said softly. But Dean, leaning against the cold stone, felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He remembered the feel of a thin wallet. He remembered the days of boxing for a few bucks and dealing cards in smoky backrooms where the house always won. He looked at Maria's face, the face of a girl who believed her wedding day had become a funeral for her dreams. He took one last drag of his cigarette, crushed out on the sole of his shoe, and slipped out the side door into the biting wind, his mind already spinning faster than a Capitol Records master tape. Dean didn't go to his car. He walked 2 blocks down to a corner drugstore, the bell chiming as he entered. The teenage girl behind the counter nearly dropped a glass jar of malted milk powder when she saw the chin, the hair, and those hooded, sleepy eyes. "Mr. Martin?" she gasped. Dean gave her that effortless, lopsided grin that had melted 1,000,000 hearts from New York to Los Angeles. "Sugar, I need your phone and a lot of quarters," he said, his voice a warm baritone that sounded like fine bourbon poured over silk. For the next 40 minutes, Dean Martin became a general. He called a restaurant owner in Pittsburgh who owed him a favor from the old nightclub days. He called a florist in Columbus. He called a local beverage distributor and told him that if he didn't have 10 cases of the finest Italian red and 20 cases of beer at the VFW Hall in 2 hours, he'd personally see to it that the man never sold another drop in the state of Ohio. He called a tailor, a baker, and finally, he made a long-distance call to a tuxedo shop in New York, barking orders with sharp, decisive clarity that contradicted his relaxed posture. When he hung up the phone for the last time, the girl behind the counter was staring at him as if he were a visiting deity. "Keep the change, honey," he said, tossing a $20 bill onto the counter, a week's wages for her. He stepped back out into the snow, the cold no longer biting quite as hard. Back at the church, the ceremony was a somber affair. The pews were filled with neighbors in their Sunday best, worn wool coats and polished but thin shoes. They prayed with fervor that only the working class truly understands, their voices rising in Latin responses that echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. Giuseppe walked Maria down the aisle, his heart breaking with every step. He felt like a fraud. He looked at the crucifix above the altar and silently begged for forgiveness for his pride, for wanting to give his daughter a night of glamour in a life that would surely be filled with the grace of the mills. As the couple exchanged vows, the air in the church felt thin, exhausted by the weight of their collective poverty. But outside, the world was changing. A fleet of black sedans and 3 large delivery trucks had pulled up to the curb, their engines idling in the slush. Men in white aprons and sharp suits began scurrying into the VFW hall across the street, moving with the synchronized precision of a Broadway stage crew. Dean stood on the sidewalk, his collar turned up, watching the activity with a quiet intensity. He saw a young man carrying a bass fiddle into the hall and nodded. He saw crates of lobster, veal, and mountainous stacks of fresh bread being carried in. He saw a woman from the florist shop hauling in armfuls of white roses and lilies, their scent momentarily defying the winter air. When the church doors finally opened and the new Mr. and Mrs. Santino stepped out into the light, they expected to walk toward a bleak reception of water and perhaps some homemade cookies in a drafty basement. Instead, they were greeted by a sight that stopped the entire wedding party in their tracks. A red carpet, literal red carpet, had been rolled out from the church steps across the street to the VFW hall. Flanking the carpet were 6 men in matching tuxedos, holding umbrellas to shield the bride from the falling snow. Giuseppe rubbed his eyes, certain that the stress had finally caused a breakdown. "What is this?" he stammered. Maria's husband, Tony, looked just as bewildered, but the crowd began to murmur as they followed the carpet. When they entered the hall, the transformation was total. The drab, wood-panel room had been draped in white silk. Hundreds of candles flickered in crystal holders, casting a golden glow over tables grown under the weight of antipasto, steaming platters of lasagna, and roasted meats that smelled of garlic and rosemary. The centerpiece was a 5-tier cake that looked like it had been stolen from a royal palace. At the far end of the room, a 7-piece orchestra sat in tuxedos, tuning their instruments. The guests stood in stunned silence, afraid to move, afraid that if they touched the silver-plated forks, the vision would vanish. Giuseppe looked around, his mouth agape, searching for an explanation. He saw Father O'Malley standing near the door, looking just as shocked. And then, from a dark corner near the bar, a man stepped out. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was still in his gray overcoat, a glass of amber liquid in one hand. He looked like he had just wandered in off the street, yet he commanded the room without saying a word. Dean Martin walked up to Giuseppe, who was trembling. "Mr. Lombardi, I believe we haven't met," Dean said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "I'm a friend of the family, from the old country. Well, the old neighborhood. Anyway." Giuseppe stared at him, his eyes widening as a realization hit. Mr. Martin? Dino?" Dean smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his eyes. "Call me Dino, Pop. I heard there was a wedding. And in this family, we don't do things halfway. Now, I think your daughter is waiting for a dance." The orchestra began to play a lush, sweeping arrangement of a popular ballad. Dean took Maria's hand, bowing deeply, and led her onto the floor for the first dance. The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and tears. For the next 4 hours, the VFW hall in Steubenville was the center of the universe. Dean didn't just provide the food and the music. He provided the soul. He moved through the crowd like a king in exile returning to his people. He kissed the grandmothers on the cheek, making them blush like schoolgirls. He told jokes to the men, stories of the road and the studio that made them roar with laughter, momentarily forgetting the strike at the mill and the bills on the kitchen table. He sat with the children and showed them card tricks he'd learned in the back rooms of the Rex cigar store years ago. He was the perfect host, the perfect guest, and the perfect son of Steubenville. But more than that, he was a bridge between their reality and the dream of what life could be. He represented the idea that one of their own had made it, and that he hadn't forgotten the smell of the river or the weight of a heavy heart. As the night wore on, the wine flowed and the tarantella sent the guests spinning in dizzying circles of joy. Dean stayed in the background for the most part, content to watch the happiness he had engineered. He saw Giuseppe sitting at the head table, his head held high, a glass of wine in his hand, and a look of profound peace on his face. He saw Maria laughing, her husband's arm around her, the despair of the morning a distant, fading memory. But the crowd wanted more. They began to chant his name. Dino! 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 Dean feigned a look of exhaustion, rolling his eyes and adjusted his tie. "Oh, all right," he said, stepping up to the microphone, "but only if the band knows something with a little swing." The room went silent. The first notes of that Amore filled the hall, and when Dean began to sing, time seemed to stop. It wasn't the voice of a record. It was the voice of a man singing to his neighbors, to his kin. When the stars make you drool, just like a pasta fazool, that's Amore. The lyrics, usually so playful, took on a sacred quality in that room. It was a hymn to their culture, to their food, to their resilience. People wept openly, not out of sadness, but out of a sudden, overwhelming sense of belonging. They were no longer just poor immigrants or struggling laborers. They were part of something grand and beautiful. In the middle of the song, Dean looked toward the back of the hall and saw a group of young men standing by the door, the tough guys of the neighborhood who usually cause trouble. They were standing perfectly still, their hats in their hands, watching him with a reverence that bordered on the religious. Dean gave them a sharp, knowing nod, a silent command to stay on the right path, and they nodded back, cowed by his effortless authority. He finished the song to a standing ovation that shook the rafters. He sang 3 more, his voice never faltering, his charm never dimming. He danced with the bride's mother, a woman who had worked 3 jobs to keep her family fed, and for those 3 minutes, she was a queen in a ballroom. He didn't act like a superstar doing a charity event. He acted like a man who was grateful to be home. He was the king of cool, but that night, he was the prince of Steubenville. Around midnight, as the first guests began to filter out into the snowy night, their bellies full and their spirits soaring, Dean found Giuseppe alone near the coat rack. The older man grabbed Dean's hand, his grip like a vice. "I can never pay you back," Giuseppe whispered. "I don't know why you did this for us. We are nothing to you." Dean looked at the man, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the hall. He thought about his own father, the barber who had worked until his fingers were stiff to give Dino a chance. He thought about the lucky breaks, the long nights, and the loneliness that often comes with fame. "You're wrong, Giuseppe," Dean said softly. "You're everything. You're the reason I sing. You're the reason I remember who I am when the cameras are off. You didn't have any money today, but you had a family that loved you enough to cry for you. That's a lot more than most of the people I know in Hollywood have." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy envelope. "This is for the honeymoon. Take them to New York. See a show. Eat at 21. Tell them Dino sent you." Giuseppe tried to refuse, but Dean simply tucked the envelope into the man's breast pocket and patted it. "Consider a loan from St. Jude," he joked. Before Giuseppe could say another word, Dean turned and walked toward the exit. He didn't wait for a final round of applause. He didn't want the thank yous or the formal goodbyes. He stepped out into the cold, the snow still falling, and found his car parked a block away. As he pulled away from the curb, he looked back at the VFW hall. The lights were still bright, the music was still playing, and the shadows of people dancing were visible against the frosted windows. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the lighter illuminating his face for a brief second. A face that looked younger, lighter, and more at peace than it had in years. He drove through the quiet streets of his hometown, past the darkened mills and the small houses with their plastic Marys on the lawns. He felt the weight of the world lift off his shoulders, replaced by the simple, profound satisfaction of a job well done. The story of a Martin wedding would become a legend in Steubenville, passed down through generations of Lombardis and Santinos. They would tell of the night the stars came down to the Ohio River, of the feast that appeared out of thin air, and of the man who heard a cry for help and answered it with a song. Maria and Tony would stay married for 50 years, their mantelpiece always graced by a grainy black and white photograph of a beautiful bride dancing with a man in a gray overcoat. For Giuseppe, the night changed everything. He realized that his worth wasn't measured by the balance in a bank account or the size of a reception, but by the community that stood behind him and the grace that sometimes visits the most unlikely places. Dean Martin went back to the bright lights of Las Vegas and the silver screens of Hollywood, back to the tuxedos and the martinis, and the persona of the man who didn't care about anything. But those who were there that night knew better. They knew that under the effortless cool and the jokes, there was a heart of a boy from Steubenville who knew exactly what it meant to have nothing, and exactly what it took to give everything. As Dean crossed the state line, the radio in his car began to play a soft, orchestral piece. He leaned back in the seat, humming along, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The snow continued to fall, covering the world in a quiet, white silence, but in his mind, he could still hear the sound of a tarantella, the clinking of wine glasses, and the voice of a father who had been given back his dignity. It was the best performance of his life, and there was a single camera there to catch it. He smiled to himself a small, private smile and drove on into the night. The king of cool, the patron of lost causes, and the man who proved that sometimes the greatest miracles don't happen in churches, but in the hearts of those who remember where they came from.